My name is Mike Pivovar. I'm a Distinguished Policy Fellow in the Center for Financial Markets and Policy here at Georgetown, and more importantly, I'm an MBA alumni from class of 1994. Just celebrated my 25th anniversary here, and the value of the degree keeps going up and up and up. So thank you, Georgetown. It was the best investment that I ever made. So thank you, Irina and stuff. So thanks. So I'm pleased to sit here with two very distinguished regulators, CFTC Commissioner Don Stump and SEC Commissioner Hester Peirce, on what is our regulatory and policy panel. And for those of you that have ever seen SEC and CFTC commissioners before, you know the first thing we have to do is our housekeeping announcement. So do you guys want to do your legal disclaimer?
Certainly. I just wanted to express that the views I share today are my own and not necessarily those of my fellow commissioners or the commission.
My views are my own views, not necessarily those of the Securities and Exchange Commission or my fellow commissioners, although Dawn and I do have some overlapping views. So
yes.
I will align myself with some of the things she'll say.
Yes.
Oh, wow, that's unfortunate. I was hoping to get you guys to disagree with a bunch of things. That's good.
Sorry.
Probably not.
Yeah. So, so the Center for Financial Markets and Policy is celebrating its 10th anniversary. So congratulations to Irina and a very successful center. So about 10 years ago is when I first met both the commissioners, back when all three of us worked in the Senate. Commissioner Stump was a senior staffer on the Senate Committee on Agriculture, and Commissioner Peirce was a senior staffer on the Senate Banking Committee. 10 years ago, we're in the middle of negotiating what became DoddFrank. So I want to go back just a little bit earlier than that. And in 2008, you both had a front row seat into the global financial crisis. And I know for many people, the global financial crisis was a watershed event, challenged some assumptions that we had about the markets and how they worked. And so my first question to both of you is, what did you learn from the financial crisis, thinking back to that time, that you carry with you today and affects how you approach regulation in your current roles?
Do you want to go? I'll go first. So it was such an interesting time because the crisis was unfolding at the exact same time. We were trying to design solutions. And I feel as though once you design something that you thought would work, someone would run in and tell you why, all of the reasons that it wouldn't work. And my takeaway from that is you can't help but respond to situations that are unfortunate, such as the financial crisis. But sometimes if you have the ability to step back and take a breath and think about all of the ramifications, you're going to have a far better outcome, because in our rush to finish things, and I know some would suggest it took some time, there were many things that I think were overlooked or left undone or not necessarily well thought out, and I think we could have done a better job if we had really taken a step back and taken a breath as opposed to responding and reacting as we did. So I do apply that to most everything I do now at the CFTC. I like to take a little break before I share my initial reaction to things. So.
And for me, I remember distinctly before the crisis, I was at the SEC as a staffer, and I remember there was something that we were considering, and essentially what we were doing is telling private firms how to manage their own risk. And I remember thinking, that seems really unnecessary. I mean, these firms have an interest in staying in business. Why do they need us to tell them how to manage risk? And so then during the crisis, when you see these firms clearly having made decisions that meant their ultimate demise, you're thinking, what was it that led them down that road? Maybe I was wrong before when I said that government shouldn't be telling you how to manage risk. And I think what I realized is that a lot of the poor decisions that these firms were making flowed directly from a regulatory incentive to behave foolishly. And so for me, when I see firms that are doing something that doesn't make sense to me, I look back for the regulatory route to see what the regulatory cause might be. And then I also am a little less willing to assume that firms are necessarily getting it right now, because I know there are a whole bunch of government incentives that are probably driving them to do things that are not wise.
So Commissioner Stump, you mentioned DoddFrank was being written in the middle of all of this that was going on. You said it was a good idea to step back. DoddFrank is 2,319 pages. it was not the end, it was the beginning of the negotiations. It told the regulators to go forth and promulgate about 400 new rules, of which the SEC and CFTC are individually and collectively responsible for over 100, maybe 150 of those rules. So following up on your point, Commissioner Stump, so what did Dodd-Frank get right? What did it get wrong, and what's missing from it? What should have been added to it that's not in there?
I'll start with what I think it got right, but it took me a number of years to develop this view. And actually, more recently, I spent a lot of time thinking about the international application of our rules. And it's so interesting to me. We actually had a meeting today at the CFTC where we were considering how we regulate foreign boards of trade. And it is fascinating that Dodd-Frank, even in the midst of the crisis and the panic that was ensuing, that Congress recognized that these, where the derivatives markets are concerned, are global, and they stipulated in various places of the statute that the CFTC subscribes to, that we should coordinate with our international counterparts. It's in no less than 4 or 5 places in the Commodity Exchange Act, and 3 of those, I believe, were put in place in the Dodd-Frank Act. And why this is important is the crisis was global, the reaction was global. There was no way to suggest that we could write regulations that would account for the universe of U.S. market participants' involvement in foreign market space, because the reality is we're all regulating in different environments. And I like to think that the G20 informed us, or informed the development of our regulations in such a way that we should be well coordinated, but we're not going to have identical regulations, Europe, Asia, the United States, but the acknowledgement that that was okay and that we should be willing to work with each other and be deferential where appropriate, so long as our regulations are comparable. And this flows throughout the Commodity Exchange Act that was amended by the Dodd-Frank Act. And so I think that was somewhat intuitive of the crafters of the Dodd-Frank Act. With regard to what it got wrong, I think what always goes wrong is what you leave until the last minute. And so when I talk about the components of Dodd-Frank that I worked on, it's almost exclusively the derivatives title. And there was wide agreement that we needed better data, that everybody needed to have more information about what types of OTC swap transactions were out there.
I think it's an important point to put out. People may not know this, but before Dodd-Frank, the CFTC and SEC were actually prohibited from collecting that data,
Yep.
correct? So the regulators had no information on
Right,
this.
we didn't have information unless we got it through like a special call, but you're right, there was a prohibition on our authority over OTC swap transactions. So everyone recognized we needed more information, so that one seemed pretty easy, although it was sometimes controversial, but we don't have to go there. And then almost the entire discussion around Title VII was how the clearing mandate was going to look and who was going to have to be subjected to mandatory clearing. And then at the very end, we had a conversation about how execution of swaps should go. And I have a view that is not included in the actual end of the, my view was that perhaps we should wait and see how that works out. Maybe we should stagger all of this and see if execution came online as a result of mandatory clearing. But that's not how the statute worked, and that's fine. I am obligated to apply the statute as it is. But the reality is there was such little thought and time at that point for the execution discussion that there's a 7-line definition for what a swap execution facility is, a few core principles that were lifted out of how we regulate futures exchanges, and very little time left in the process because we were rushing to finish Dodd-Frank at that time. And it's really provided a odd interpretation by the agency depending on which commissioner you talk to at the CFTC or which chairman you talk to. And the reality is the industry was almost left to their own to devise this, which is something I normally think to be appropriate. The industry knows best. Let's let them develop it in a way that makes sense. But in this case, I think it left more questions than answers, and I think we could have done a little bit better job of designing the execution mandate. I won't suggest specifically what I think was left out. I will say, 10 years later, we have the benefit of time and information, and so there are a number of things I could point to and say, oh, we should have done that or we should have done this, but at the time we didn't have that information. So I want to be fair to the people who crafted Dodd-Frank, the people who initially implemented it. I will say I think Europe's process of having a formal review of their regulatory reactions is a good one, and so I think we are wise to look. The G20 directive on derivatives actually said, in the midst of the crisis, you should be constantly reassessing whether or not these regulations are fit for purpose, and I think we should be doing that. It's been 10 years. Our markets are totally different than they were 10 years ago. Some good, some bad, but just totally different. So I think that a look back would have been appropriate.
We're still trying to write our rules, so we're not ready to look back, but we can look back at yours and see what you did wrong and try to get it right in ours. But now everyone wants us to do things exactly the way the CFTC did because they're already doing it that way. So you can't win for waiting, I guess. As far as I'm concerned, in terms of Dodd-Frank, I have been quite critical of it. I'm not a big fan of the legislation, but I too am a regulator now, and so it's really not my job to question the legislation. It's my job to implement it as best as I can. I think there are certain aspects of it that are good. I mean, we got the ability to do investor testing, which was something that I think the SEC really needed. We got a whistleblower regime, which I think was an important thing to get. It's not the easiest one to implement, but I think it's a good regime to have. In general, I think the approach that Dodd-Frank took was one that was very much an outgrowth of a crisis in which people were very scared. And when people are scared, what do they try to do? They try to pull control in, and they want to be able to feel in control in the next crisis, which means you give lots of power to the government to make decisions, and those decisions then flow through the financial regulatory system to financial institutions across the regulatory system, which means that you have everyone running in the same direction, and that can be very dangerous when you have a crisis because everyone can run in the same direction over the cliff because they have to, because the rules tell them they have to do that. So my concern is that it's too regulatory-centric of an approach. We would be better off with an approach that left more decisions in the hands of private actors, but also made it very clear that if they failed and made bad decisions, the responsibility would lie on them as well.
So Commissioner Stump mentioned one thing she thought should have been included was for sort of retrospective review of existing rules. Would you agree with that? And is there anything else you think should have been included?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of, there are a lot of aspects, there are a lot of things that could have been addressed. I mean, there could have been more on housing, for example. Housing finance was an issue in the crisis. But I think really my biggest concern is about the direction that it did go in, as opposed to what else should have been included.
Yeah, and I think that one, so retrospective review of existing rules is one where the independent agencies, the financial regulators don't have to do it, but sometimes do it, and it's good practice, and it's a perfect example of where you have the intersection of the regulators, the market participants, and the academics providing information about what have been the effects so far on a particular rule, intended or unintended, and then that helps regulators formulate better policy going forward. Let me pick up on something, Commissioner Peirce, that you mentioned, where you said that the SEC is not done writing its rules yet in the over-the-counter derivatives market. So for the students in the room, the Dodd-Frank gave split authority in the over-the-counter derivatives market. It gave what we call swaps to the CFTC and security-based swaps to the SEC, and told them to promulgate rules. In some cases, write your own rules. In some cases, kind of coordinate with each other on the rules. The CFTC went forward very quickly and finished most of their rules, and the SEC has been quite slow in a number of these cases. Deliberate, cautious, right, is the right word, right? But, right, and so you have volunteered, Commissioner Peirce, to work with the CFTC, your counterparts, on behalf of the SEC to try to harmonize the rules, right? And you mentioned that the CFTC has some rules that are outstanding, and there may be some things that are not perfect about those rules, but yet the industry has moved forward and changed their systems, and industry practices have changed on that. On the other hand, there's an opportunity to look fresh at looking at what's best. how do you think about those trade-offs, and how do you think about working with the CFTC on whether we should, take a fresh look, fresh change on something and then disrupt what's already out there, or just kind of, it's close enough, so let's move on somewhere else?
Well, I think one of the reasons I wanted to work on this project is because I wanted the chance to work with the CFTC. I'm working with one of Don's colleagues on sort of coordinating our coordination, and that's been a very positive experience for me, because I think we all realize that these two agencies need to work together. And so I can be really candid with them and say, hey, what's working, what's not, and we can talk about, our staffs are working together to try to come to as close harmony as they can, and we can talk to them and say, hey, are you thinking of revisiting this requirement? If you are, let's try to be aligned. It's not easy, because the timelines can be difficult to mesh as well, but I think all in all, it's been a really good experience to try to learn from them, and then to try to help, they give us insight on what we can do, and we may be able to give them some insights too on where we're going, so that we can be tied together. So that's kind of how I think about it. It's the international point is an important one too. So we're not only trying to be domestically as harmonized as possible, but we're also trying to think, how do we recognize other countries' regimes in a market that's very much international? And obviously we can't be in the position of regulating everything that happens in other countries, so we have to show respect for what they're doing, and hope that they'll show respect for what we're doing. So it's a little bit of a dance, but I think it has been a really productive one.
Another area in which the CFTC and the SEC have not sort of moved at the same pace is an area in which the markets have evolved beyond what was in existence after the financial crisis and after DoddFrank, and that's in the area of cryptocurrencies and digital assets, right? So those didn't even exist back then. The CFTC has allowed Bitcoin futures contracts to be listed and traded on futures exchanges. While the SEC has not approved Bitcoin to be included in any mutual funds or exchange-traded funds, and we had one of our panelists in the earlier session predicted it won't be anytime soon. And so, Commissioner Stump, first of all, so can you tell us how the CFTC is approaching this increasing interest, and there's also an increasing institutionalization we see in the markets here, and the decision to allow for the listing and trading of Bitcoin futures contracts?
I think one distinction between our regulatory regimes, and one that I think works quite well at the CFTC, is we have what we call an opportunity for market participants to self-certify when something is compliant with our general core principles. And so this has worked well at the CFTC due to the fact that whether we're talking about the corn contract, a corn futures contract, or an interest rate futures contract, or a Bitcoin futures contract, we have a general set of principles that everybody has to subscribe to. And if we find that when someone self-certifies that they're going to list a contract on an exchange, that we find that it's not in compliance with this set of core principles, we would stop that from happening. But it does lend itself to being quite nimble in approving new innovative contracts on futures exchanges. I do want to be clear, though, the CFTC's regulatory regime extends to futures contracts, swaps contracts, and some retail transactions. We do not extend our regulatory application to the underlying cash crypto assets. There's a lot of confusion out there about this, because where we do involve ourselves in the underlying cash market is when we find fraud. And the reason that the CFTC, Congress saw fit to give the CFTC authority, anti-fraud authority, over the underlying commodity itself, not just the derivatives contract, which is what we typically regulate, is because that underlying commodity influences the price of the futures contract or the swap, the derivatives contract. And as such, we need to ensure there's no fraudulent activity in the underlying. So we have exercised our fraud authority with regard to Bitcoin itself. But we have no regulatory regime, as far as our regulatory regime is listing a futures contract, trading a swaps contract, some leveraged and margin retail transactions. And so I always like to point that out because I think there's a bit of confusion out in the marketplace about what the CFTC is actually doing. So it is a bit confusing. There is still, there's a lot of room for the regulatory community to come in and look at the underlying assets. The CFTC will be looking at the derivatives contracts. So.
And anything on the horizon with the CFTC that?
I anticipate that there will be other futures contracts listed because they're, we have, the way it works is we have exchanges or execution platforms that register with us. It's quite a cumbersome process, but once they register with us, then they go through the process I mentioned before that they can certify that they're compliant with our core principles and listing new contracts. And we do have a fair bit of scrutiny around even that self-certification process. But I anticipate that beyond Bitcoin that there are other exchanges looking at other products, and I have no reason to believe we wouldn't treat them the same as we have others and apply the same scrutiny we have, and I think that's worked really well for us. I don't mean to minimize the uniqueness of crypto assets or to suggest that they are like the core and futures contract, but as far as applying a set of principles, I think we have a good set of principles that are general enough and our regulations are principled enough that we can extend them to various asset classes.
Commissioner Peirce, so Commissioner Stump mentioned the concerns about manipulating the price in the underlying spot contract, and that was one of the reasons why the SEC has taken a more, what are your words, deliberate approach with respect to digital assets or cryptocurrencies. The SEC has still not approved any ETF or mutual fund to hold cryptocurrencies, citing one of the concerns is the potential manipulation of the prices, and has taken very much an investor protection type approach to this. You've been critical of this approach. Can you talk about what the investor protection concerns are that are driving the approach and tell us why you disagree with them and think that there should be a different approach?
Well, honestly, I don't fully understand the investor protection concerns that are driving it. I would argue that investor protection includes giving investors access to a broad array of investment opportunities. Some of these things aren't even, some of the tokens that we've made it difficult for people to buy are not even securities, but putting that aside you're talking about the exchange traded products. I think what my colleagues at the SEC would say is, look, the underlying market is clearly full of problems, and so there's no way that you can build a securities product on top of it and have it trade in a way that is protected from that bad conduct in the market below. I would argue that sometimes we look at a market and we say it must be regulated exactly like any securities market is regulated. I would say, you know what, there are self-regulatory mechanisms in markets that exist even if there's not a government regulator in place, and so we can see that we can see which exchanges might be working well and which not. And so I'm not as concerned that we have to have 100% confidence that every market in which Bitcoin trades is a perfect market in order to build a product on top of it. And what we're doing is we're not allowing investors to get access to a product that they've expressed real interest in getting access to. And I guess what we would prefer is that they get access through the markets that we're saying we don't like, rather than through our own markets, which I think is kind of a funny result.
Mm-hmm. And so as I mentioned, our previous panelist, I believe it was Reggie Brown from GTS, was the one who said that he sees that the SEC is not going to do it anytime soon. Are your arguments starting to win the day with your fellow commissioners,
Well, I mean, I think so far they've fallen flat because we haven't seen anything actually get approved. I thought it was funny because I was listening to a podcast recently, and they were going back. This was a crypto podcast, and they were going back and forth. And someone said, "Well, the commissioner at the SEC, Hester Peirce, said X, Y, Z," and then someone else said, "Hey, you know that there actually are 5 commissioners at the SEC. It's not just Hester." And the person said, oh, wow, I didn't realize that. And then I'm thinking, well, why do you think, you know what I think, and you know nothing's gotten approved, so you might be able to put two and two together there. But, I continue to try to make the arguments, but I think there's a lot of resistance. This is, unfortunately, people still constantly go back and they say, this is just something in a space that's all about illegal behavior, and so why should we want to foster cryptocurrencies, because they're all about bad things happening in the marketplace. And that really is ignoring the fact that lots of bad things happen with cash too. So I think I have to continue to push back against those narratives.
Yeah. So Commissioner Stump, one of your jobs as commissioner is you're sponsor of the CFTC's Global Market Advisory Committee. And the members include industry professionals, representatives of futures exchanges, and market participants. And the purpose is to advise the CFTC on issues that affect the integrity and competitiveness of U.S. markets and firms engaged in global business. What are the key issues that this committee is working on right now?
Everything. This is like, it touches everything. But it's funny, when I was listening to Commissioner Peirce talk about the opportunity that I think the SEC has to learn from the things that the CFTC put in place very early on, and not to be critical of past CFTC commissions, but I sometimes think we suffer from first mover disadvantage. And so one of the things that the committee is focusing on is taking a look back. It is even though it's not embedded in our statute, or it's not common that we would do a holistic review of all of the things that were included in our mandate, we've taken a look back at what I call like the 4 core elements of the DoddFrank Act and the regulatory response, which were mandatory clearing, execution on platform, reporting, and the idea that margin would need to be posted in the event that transactions were not subjected to clearing. And we're just sort of initializing that review, but one area we've already identified that really could benefit from advice from this sort of a group is the implementation of the final phases of the last one I mentioned, which was we have this mechanism whereby we require market participants to post margin amongst themselves, even though they're not clearing a transaction. And that's fine, except that we've identified some really interesting obstacles for smaller market participants that weren't obvious to us when we put the rules in place, because the rules were initially designed with very large bank dealers involved in the conversation. And so we've initiated a subcommittee who's going to provide us some advice on how we might address those things, and how we might address them so that we're more consistent globally. Is there something that Europe is doing? We all agree to do these in a common way, and as best we can, we are. But are there things that are preventing global market participants from actually operating efficiently because there are confusing distinctions between the way the U.S. has done it and the way other jurisdictions have done it? So that's just one example of something we're looking at.
Good. And everything else.
And everything else.
Everything
so
else,
if anybody
too.
has any ideas of a global problem in the derivatives market, we would love to hear your ideas. And not just problems. I mean, this group is a fantastic, I think all the commissioners have found it to be a fantastic forum for dialogue and identifying issues that are really causing angst among global market participants. And almost everyone in our markets are global market participants. I think the assumption is that we're talking about big global banks. There are very few market participants who don't have a global footprint in the derivatives markets. So.
All right, good. So I'm going to ask you each one more quick question about advice for students, and then that'll be the final question. And if folks want to go ahead and start lining up for Q&A, and we get back on track. There's a question that Rina Agarwal likes to ask when she does the panels. And what advice do you have for students? So the undergraduate business students and the MBA business students. What advice do you have for them?
Advice. This just happened today, so I'm going to use this. Commissioner Peirce and I were talking before we came out here, and she had an open meeting today. I had an open meeting today. So there are times at which there's a panic in devising our statements. And I also, at 9:55 this morning, was in a panic because there were too many people doing too many things in my office to really help me with this. But so again, this is going to sound ridiculous, and it's probably something you learned in elementary school, not necessarily at this stage of your education, but pay attention to take every writing course you can take every communication course you can take, because there are going to be times in your career where you're going to have 5 minutes to write it down, say it, or present something in a coherent way. And I think it is really challenging. I say this to my children all the time. If you can't write, you are going to have a really hard time like making it through this life, because unfortunately there are so many things that the current generation has at their disposal. One of my children loves to just talk into his phone and assume it's going to dictate everything he wanted to say. And I'm of the, but you don't know how to write, like the lost art of writing. So anyway.
That's great advice, I think. My advice would be just be curious and ask a lot of questions. I think that if you are too focused on the little thing that you're working on and you forget to ask the bigger picture questions, you really miss out on a lot. And it's much more fun if you're constantly thinking, constantly curious, constantly asking questions.
Great. All right. So the first question will come from someone who is very curious and
Yes,
a very good
indeed.
writer, Professor Jim Angel.
Why, thank you. Thank you for being here. I'm honored that we have 3 veterans of the Battle of DoddFrank here today.
Who lived to tell about it.
We all bear scars,
and
but
maybe you can clear up a big mystery which has mystified me for years.
Oh, no.
Now, if you look at the anti-fraud provisions in the Securities Act and the Commodity Exchange Act, they're very, very similar. Any kind of artifice to deceive is bad. But when Congress passed Dodd-Frank, they added very specific language banning spoofing in commodities, but not securities. Why the difference? There must be a story, but I haven't quite figured it out yet.
I'm happy to give you my version of what I think happened at the time.
go for it.
Do you want to get
No,
first?
go for it. I just had a snarky answer.
No, you go ahead then. You go.
Oh, we
you go
definitely want to
first.
hear that then.
No, I was just going to say, because the SEC will do whatever it wants regardless of what the statute says, so we don't need extra authority, but I'm sorry.
I have a kind
Go
of a
ahead,
snarky
Dawn.
answer too. but
I
go ahead.
actually have struggled with this particular authority since I've been at the agency. I think that it was at the request of CFTC staff that it was inserted into the Dodd-Frank Act, which is fine. That happens often. The CFTC staff will submit recommendations and technical advice to Congress for thought and deliberation on whether it should be included. Having sat in the legislative seat at that time, I often joked with my colleagues, are we really going to put the word spoofing in the Commodity Exchange Act? I recognize it's a term of art, but I was offended by the I don't know, it just seemed like it was very informal for statutory text, and yet I lost that battle. So
I will say, if we had listened to more of Dawn's advice on the statute, it would be much better than it was, because Mike and I did get to work with Dawn during this process, and I remember learning so much from her because she had such deep knowledge about what was going on and about what the problems were going to be if various things went into the statute. So I'm sorry that we didn't take more of your advice.
and vice versa. I think much of all of our advice was excluded, but that's okay. We have what we have, and it's working.
Professor
So.
Angel's not satisfied.
Well,
Until he
so,
hears
but was
Mike's
any
answer.
thought, given that like, oh, this is a good idea in commodities, shouldn't we do the same thing in securities? Did the SEC weigh in and say, no, we don't
Well,
want
I
anything?
think one thing to remember about the time, and this is really seriously spoken, there was a lot of stuff being added at the very last minute, and because as Mike mentioned, this is a giant statute, as you well know, and so much was happening at the very last minute that it was really hard to sort of sit down and think, oh, we should look at these side by side and think, if it makes sense in one context, does it make sense in another? Again, I'm not saying that I want that authority to be at the SEC, but that probably was what happened. It was probably more just no one had the luxury of sitting down and thinking about that, I would guess.
That's my best guess. I mean, there's what was literally happening at the end, to Commissioner Stump's point about how stuff was just added at the end, and Commissioner Purse's point was like, all right, let's look at it side by side. What some of the staffers were doing were literally, they were writing it for swaps, and then they would copy, paste, and replace swaps with security-based swaps and put it over in the SEC one. And there's actually one that's missing. I think, is it swap data repositories or security-based swap data repositories? There's a provision that they literally forgot to copy and paste and change over on that one. So I don't know whether spoofing, if that was one they forgot to copy and paste over, or whether there was a conscious decision not to include it, or whether it was just
committees working on things, there were various
Well, that's a good point,
committees
too. I mean, I think that's something that people outside Congress don't necessarily know. So we share regulation of the capital markets, but we're overseen by two different sets of committees in Congress. And so because of that, you sometimes don't get the meshing up of things that you might get if we were overseen by the same committee.
And another history question. I'm intrigued by what Commissioner Purse said about the failures of risk management before the financial crisis and how they were a result of regulatory incentives. Can you give a few examples of particular regulatory incentives and how that led to such pathological outcomes?
So I think one example, a common one, is credit rating agencies. We basically built into the statute this reliance on credit rating agencies known as NRSROs that we approved, and that kind of led this to be built into lots of different rules, and then it gave those credit rating agencies more power than they otherwise would have had, and you could rely on them, and it's kind of like, oh, we have the rating, what more do we need? There were also incentives, and again, I hate to step outside of my securities regulator role, but I sometimes do it to complain about bank regulators. And there were bank regulations that favored holding mortgage-backed securities and gave preferential capital treatment to holding them, and it didn't really matter what the quality of the underlying mortgages was. So it really gave this huge incentive for people to just have this hunger for mortgages so they could package them up and break them into securities and hold them themselves and sell them. So I think those are two examples.
All right, I think that's it for our session to get us back on time.
Excuse me, I have a question.
No, I'm sorry, we're done. We're moving on. So please join me in thanking our two panelists here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.